All right, thank you everyone for coming this morning. We today will talk about one of the flagship publications of the International Transport Forum. That publication is the ITF Outlook. You may have seen their copies in the back of the room. This is what it looks like. It is our biannual report on scenarios about the future. And we thought that in the discussion around transport futures, it would be helpful to have some ideas, not based on strict forecasts, but based on some plausible scenario thinking globally, both for passenger transport and for freight transport, to start a conversation among our ministries, among our members, but with our ministries and their constituents, and broadly, more broadly, with people that are concerned about the future of transport around the world. Now, this is the DNA, if you will, of the ITF Transport Outlook, a set of storylines that are backed with some very robust modeling, but that describe possible futures. And we'll present those futures today. And then we'll have a discussion based, stimulated, inspired by those futures with 5 experts that will represent different views. During the conversation, I'll turn to many of you and ask for some input, whether or not you agree with some of the views, whether or not you have dissident views or different ways of considering these things. But in order to make sure that we have enough time, we'll go ahead and start right away with a presentation by Jari Kaupura, who is the head of the Quantitative Policy Analysis and Foresight Division of the International Transport Forum. Now, we struggled a lot about how to make sure that we would get enough people in this room. Of course, there is the strength of this document. But then for the speaker, we thought maybe we should get some of the K-pop singers that we had yesterday. But we have something better. And so Jari is going to be better than K-pop this morning and present the ITF 2019 Outlook. Jari, please come on stage.
Thank you, Philip, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here to present some of the highlights of the ITF Transport Outlook 2019 edition. I fear I might not live up to the expectation of the K-pop, because that was pretty fantastic last night. I hope that you don't use those cubes that you have on your chair to throw them at me if I'm not living up to that expectation either today. We actually launched the ITF Transport Outlook just yesterday in a press conference. And we had a very good reception and a lot of tough questions as well, which I'm sure Philip will come back in his moderation with the panel as well. But I just want to start with, as Philip was mentioning, what the ITF Outlook is. It is a strategic tool for us. We look at long-term development of global transport, demand, volumes, and related CO2 emissions, health impacts, anything to do with sustainable mobility. And like Philip was saying as well, it really allows us to look at how the world could change if different policies or different development paths take place. One of the features of the transport sector at the moment is increasing uncertainty. A lot of the projections for future depend on understanding how the socioeconomic changes have affected transport demand in the past, how demographics, population, GDP, trade patterns, transport policies, what were their impacts in past? So our work relies on that understanding. At the same time, as I said, uncertainty is really an inherent element of future transport scenarios. We see slowing economic growth, we see changes in demographics, in travel behavior, in technology, innovations, and in terms of disruptions as well, which we will come back to later. So this makes projecting future even harder and harder. Given still those uncertainties, we were bold enough to make projections of the future. And when we do projections, we call them rather scenarios than forecasts. So these are alternative future pathways for the transport sector, depending on which path you choose. However, in our what we call current ambition scenario, in our baseline, if you wish, we do project that the passenger transport will triple by 2050 globally. This is driven by growing population, income growth, and simply need for people for mobility to access their opportunities around the world. The changing demographics, changing trade patterns, GDP growth pattern is really reflected in the fact that China and India alone will generate 1/3 of global passenger kilometers by 2050. And the OECD share, which today is around 45% of passenger kilometers, will fall below 25 by 2050. So this really shows the shift in the patterns of mobility at the global level. Another interesting thing what we found out was that the non-urban transport and the road transport is actually the largest mode by 2050. This is something that we don't tend to focus a lot on. We tend to focus a lot on urban areas and international travel. But the travel between the cities, within the regions, is growing rapidly. And there's less, I would say, policies that are even looking at this part of the transport pattern. Urban transport is growing less fast than the global passenger transport demand, partly driven by the fact that we have constraints in our cities in terms of the space available for additional travel, in terms of additional congestion that all the travel causes, etc. But we still think and look that the urban passenger transport is to double by 2050 at the global level. Interesting what we found, and in our projections, we project that the shared mobility is actually the fastest growing mode and will cover a significant amount of the urban passenger transport by 2050. And when we talk about shared mobility at the moment, we're talking about all modes, all types of shared mobility, free-floating shared vehicle systems that we've seen coming up in our cities recently a lot, shared bikes, scooters, motorbikes, shared cars, but also shared taxis and minibuses. At the same time, this is our baseline projection. The future growth of some of these shared services will certainly depend on the policy responses and policy frameworks that we put in place in our cities. And of course, the companies' responses to them. Several cities have started acting on some of the accidents, some of the congestion that the free-floating scooters, for example, are causing in the cities. So there'll be a significant element of the policy response in the growth of these. We see also very strong public transport ridership growth, especially in non-OECDs, for rail and metro lines, but also buses. Car use is still dominant in the urban travel, but we project it actually to be declining by 2050 for the reasons I already mentioned before. Freight sector, in our view, is the subject for the greatest uncertainties. Still, we project the freight ton kilometers to triple by 2050 at the global level. Maritime continues to dominate freight in terms of the ton kilometers for the obvious reasons of long distances and big amount of goods carried. But the road freight is also growing strongly as in the baseline, as these goods need to be moved from the ports to consumption centers and vice versa. But the uncertainties that we have related in the economic growth, the future trade patterns, the composition of the trade in the future as well, make it difficult to anticipate the growth and make it difficult for the transport policymakers to anticipate where the bottlenecks will be in the future and where we should plan our investments in the future. So that's the first part of the ITF Transport Outlook. We look at the demand for transport. We look at how this demand is growing. The second part looks at how can we deliver that demand. What modes can be used to deliver? And we have several policy scenarios where we look at this. We look at the current ambition and high ambition. Here's a list of the policies that we have looked at in the Outlook. I will not go to the details of those at this point, but just to highlight that in terms of CO2 emissions, the current ambitions are not enough to achieve the climate goals. The transport-related CO2 emissions are projected to grow over 60% by 2050 under the current policy scenarios. With more ambitious policies, with the existing policies, you can reduce emissions by 30%. but there's still far away from the well below 2-degree ambition that the countries are looking at. These policies will lead to shift in sectors. One of the interesting things we see is that the share of urban transport declines in all scenarios. I think this is the reflection of the fact that current policy focus is really on urban transport. Regional passenger transport, non-urban freight, and international freight increase their shares. Apologies, I need some water. Before we start talking about disruptions, I need to disrupt the presentation for a second. Now, anytime we present the outlook for our audience, we get the question, yes, but what about 3D printing? What about teleworking? How those will affect? So 2019, we really focused on disruptions. We built several different scenarios. We stress test these and see what could be the alternative future if these disruptions take place. Here's the list of the disruptions we've been looking at. In the outlook, we look at all of them. We do a literature review. We look at what is the likelihood of these disruptions to take place. But then we actually carry out scenarios that are most disruptive and then discuss how those might affect the future. For urban passenger transport, we looked at teleworking, shared mobility, autonomous driving, mobility as a service, and then combined with different policy responses in terms of access restrictions and parking pricing. We have a lot of details in the report on the assumptions, on the results of those, but in terms of the urban disruption, what our finding says, it's really important to manage that change. Unmanaged disruptions lead to modal shift towards private car use, especially in the urban areas. Automation alone can lead to growth in vehicle kilometers. I don't think that the future where we want to live is where average vehicle occupancy in the cities is below 1. Cars moving, repositioning themselves by themselves in the cities. So this really speaks on behalf of managing that disruption, putting in place policy actions or regulation that supports transition, which then can result in significantly more sustainable urban mobility. So combining this disruption, automation, shared mobility, perhaps with electrification at the same time, can lead to a very different future compared to one of each of them separately. In terms of interurban passenger transport, we looked at the emergence of long-haul, low-cost carriers, energy innovation, autonomous vehicles, shared transport for long-distance travel, ultra-high-speed rail, not only high-speed rail as we see today, but emergence of maglev and even hyperlooped, how those might affect future transport demand. In terms of the non-urban transport, which I mentioned before, is the fastest growing part of the transport sector. We look at in the baseline that there's no major mode shift expected, even with some of the disruptions that we see coming up. It's not very sensitive to some of the technology or policy changes, and actually some of the reduced cost as a result of some of these disruptions might lead to longer trips, which again really reinforces the fact that we need both technological and policy disruptions to cut the CO2 emissions from the future non-urban travel. And finally, the freight transport. As I mentioned, probably the largest disruptions are expected on this, and it's already subject to largest uncertainties. We looked at e-commerce, 3D printing, new trade routes, energy innovation, autonomous trucks, high-capacity vehicles. As I mentioned, we discussed the likelihood of some of these disruptions in the outlook, and however, the scenarios we built were put at the extreme. So there are disruptions that we feel are perhaps unlikely at the short term. For example, some of the new trade routes, possibly unlikely at the Arctic route, or 3D printing. There's some uncertainties of how far that actually can push us. but then the potential impact of those disruptions can be large. And as I said already, really the potential impact of disruptions on the freight sector is the largest. As a result of different combination of these disruptions, we can see massive changes in transportation costs, in the activities and in the supply chains that we have today. This will lead in changes in trade patterns, in the way we use infrastructure and where we use the infrastructure, and probably will have a huge impact on the logistics chains, how they've been formulated around the world. And as even with the baseline scenario, this uncertainty related to the potential impact of these disruptions poses a great challenge for investment decisions for the decision makers. Where should we invest? What type of infrastructure and when? And all these questions make it very hard for decision makers, but also for companies, for industry, for all the actors in the transport sector to react on that. Now, the final key takeaways. What are our messages for policymakers in terms of disruptions alone? The first point is that the transport policy has to evolve to anticipate these disruptions that quite often are originating outside of the transport sector. Here, data is crucial for us to better understand the dynamics and potential impacts of these disruptions. We need more data. We need also better planning tools to improve adaptability to these uncertainties. Scenario planning is one way, which helps decision makers to select policies that are more robust to the largest number of possible futures. And that's some of the element and the sort of the fundamental thinking behind of our scenario building is to test those scenarios and help them to select which are the policies that can really be most robust for all these different alternative futures. But we also need to design transport systems themselves that are adaptable to these changes. This is extremely important. And finally, transport systems will benefit from new policy frameworks that foster innovation. As we've seen already today, the technological innovation, the new business models that we've seen, they are changing and much faster than regulation. They're emerging at a much faster level. So we need to move from static regulation to regulation that enables frequent review of these regulatory policy frameworks as well. And we need robust risk assessment related to those decision making. So I leave it here for my part. Our team is actually here available, and myself after the session, if you have detailed questions about the assumptions, about the outlook, about the models themselves and our results, and we'd be happy to discuss that. But I think what we want to have now is to Philip take the floor and bring the panel in to have a discussion on some of these outcomes. But at the same time, we want this to be the springboard. The outlook should be the starting point for the discussion of the likelihood of this disruption and the policy responses, and are we ready for all these disruptions that are coming up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jari. Kiitos.
Ole hyvä.
So I'll ask for our panelists to come up, please, and I'll introduce them each. We've picked, as I said, a number of people that can provide a different viewpoint. Sit wherever you want. Just leave this seat available for me. So I'll introduce them to you first, so you're familiar with them. Åsa Wagland, here, is the Senior Advisor and Deputy Director of the Swedish Ministry of Infrastructure. Åsa is responsible for emerging technologies such as connected, cooperative, shared, and automated mobility, as well as mobility as a service. MAS. She also manages the Swedish Prime Minister's Innovation Partnership Program in next generation travel and transportation, and develops policy and strategies for transport and mobility, as well as gender objectives and gender mainstreaming in the transport sector and in the ministry. Next to her is Alan McKinnon, Professor of Logistics at Kuhn Logistics University in Hamburg. Hamburg, by the way, is where I made an unscheduled stop due to the bad weather on the way into Berlin. Alan has been researching and teaching in freight transport logistics for 40 years. When I first met him, you had darker hair. and has published extensively on many different aspects of the subject. Much of his research in recent years has been on the decarbonization of logistics. As you can see from Jari's presentation, this is a central element in our outlook. Professor McKinnon has been an advisor to several governments, parliamentary committees, and international organizations, including the ITF OECD, the World Bank, European Commission, the United Nations, and the IPCC. He was the chairman of the World Economic Forum's Logistics Council and the Transport Advisory Group of the EU Horizon 2020 Research Program. Next to him is Secretary General Karen van Kloisen of the Polis Network. Polis is the leading European network of cities and regions focusing on urban transport innovation. Now, for 30 years already, their members have been working together to develop sustainable and innovative urban mobility solutions for the city of today and tomorrow, including those outlooks, those time horizons that are in the ITF Outlook. Polis supports the exchange of experiences between European, local, and regional authorities, facilitates the dialogue with other actors of the transport sector, including industry and research, and acts on the urban mobility voice of its members towards European institutions. I should add also that they interact quite extensively internationally as well for cities that are facing similar concerns as those in Europe. Next to Karen is Ramon Cruz, International Policy Program Director, Institute for Transportation and Development Policy. Since 2009, he has worked for the ITDP's Global Policy Program in different processes for the United Nations, within the UNFCCCC, the Post-2015 Agenda, the Commission on Sustainable Development, the Rio +20 process, Habitat 3, and the Partnership on Sustainable Low-Carbon Transport. He was Senior Policy Analyst at the Living Cities Program of the Environmental Defense Fund, Vice President for Energy and Environment at the Partnership for New York City, and most recently, Vice President of the Environmental Quality Board, which is the environmental regulatory agency in Puerto Rico. Next to Ramon is Maximilian Eichhorn, Vice President of Strategy at Siemens Mobility. Max is the Global Head of Strategy and Business Development for Siemens Mobility. They are a world market leader in sustainable transport technologies for both rail and road. He's also served as the Head of Digital Transformation of Siemens Intelligent Transport Systems, CEO of Siemens Mobility Australia, and the Global Head of Siemens Software Solutions for Railways. Siemens is also a member of the International Transport Forum's Corporate Partnership Board, and as such, helps the ITF think about what the future holds for transport policy. So thank you all for joining us today. Now, as you can see from Jari's presentation, uncertainty is one of the key themes, it's one of the key elements, it's one of the key questions that we have in the Transport Outlook. It's also a key question that many transport ministries have, that many people here at this conference have in the back of their mind. So I would like to ask each of you, from your own perspective, how prepared do you feel that the transport sector is to anticipate and adapt to disruption? Alan, I'll start with you. It's on.
Is it on? Yeah, okay. Not very well prepared, it seems to me. I would agree with Jari's point that I think the freight sector in particular is exposed to a lot of disruptive trends, some of them technological. You mentioned 3D printing, for example. There's also e-commerce. In fact, all the ones that you've included, I think, are big uncertainty factors. But there are other things which I think have been excluded from this year's Transport Outlook, which I think could be very influential in the way that our global supply chains develop. For example, transforming our energy infrastructure. The Outlook report looks at the reduction in the amount of fossil fuel we'll be moving as we wean ourselves off fossil fuel. But what it doesn't do is look at the amount of freight movement that will be required to put in place a renewable energy infrastructure, which is going to be a dramatic change. It's going to be very material and transport intensive. We're also going to have to adapt our built environment, our transport networks, to all the climate change that is actually in the pipeline. So adaptation, climate proofing, I think is going to generate an awful lot more ton kilometres over that time period. And there are a lot of other changes that will occur outside the transport arena, changes in patterns of consumption. many of which will be climate driven. So if one looks at household heating, we're going to have to move away from gas-fired boilers to electric heating, drawing hopefully on very low carbon electricity in the future as well. Air conditioning is currently growing enormously around the world, partly climate driven. And it'd be interesting, maybe in a future edition of the Transport Outlook report, to try to quantify some of the effects of these trends I've mentioned on tonne kilometres, because I think certainly over a 30-year time frame, these things could be quite significant. But at the moment, little research has been done on this, so there's a lot of uncertainty.
Certainly the CO2 emission profile of all the changes that are required because of the changes are not in the... Åsa, you have...
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Well, I think the first thing is... Well, first I say, no, we're not prepared, okay? But first
is that a general no, or is that a specific no?
It's a general no, but the first thing is to be aware of that you are not prepared. So we got the awareness, okay? But so now we need to work on the disruptions and see what we can do in Sweden. We have a fairly new government, and that also meant that we have a new ministry for infrastructure, where we have put transportation, digitalization and energy in the same ministry. Mm-hmm. And we have two ministers that are really working together. The Minister Eneroth, who is here today, he is the main minister for the whole new ministry, but also for transport. And then a colleague of him that has digitalization and energy together. And we think building that ministry with those three elements is one way of coping with it. So we are aware and we're working on it, but we're not totally prepared.
I think that's an important message, is that, on the governance side, on the side of public authorities, we have to be ready to disrupt ourselves, to manage disruption. Max, I want to ask you, what are your views on this? Because you are often part of the disruptors. How satisfied are you with the readiness of those that you interact with within the industry and outside of the industry on managing these type of disruptions going forward?
So indeed, I'm representing an industry supplier, so a different perspective in the supply chain and in the delivery of transport, not in the policy. Overall, we obviously see trends, or they have already realized. Digitalization is true, is there. Automatic train operation is there. We can drive trains without driver. With that, we can increase safety, increase capacity, throughput. And I think what I'm a little bit missing is more decisions to implement these technologies. Because we, from an industry perspective, we have the technologies ready. Do we have everything what is required tomorrow already today? Not yet. But if we have decisions, if we have a stable environment, then we can obviously provide better solutions to fulfill the demands, to fulfill the decarbonization targets in order to make the overall goal to keep our planet safer much better.
Karen, a lot of the disruptions, at least on the urban side, will have major impact in cities. And that level of governance, of city government and regional government, is going to be a key one going forward. What's your assessment on the readiness level? Of course, it may be different, but among the readiness levels of your members?
Adapting is one thing, anticipating is another. There are many innovations coming our way at a very fast pace, all at the same time, and this is a real challenge for our cities. And linking into the uncertainty, which of these innovations are there to stay? That's another question. If you had told me 2 years ago that we were going to be flooded by scooters, I would have laughed. I didn't see it coming back then, or I didn't take it seriously, maybe. Okay, now they're here, but are they going to stay? That's another question. But so our members are more in a kind of catching up situation where they try to regulate once the innovations suddenly pop up. At the same time, what we're trying to do as well is raise awareness and help them anticipate. We talk a lot already about automation, but it's not there yet on our streets. But we try to raise awareness with our cities that if they do not frame these innovations like automated vehicles, where there is a general optimism bias, I think, that they might make things worse, as is also mentioned in the report. You know, it can also increase the number of kilometers traveled. It can enhance urban sprawl if this is not framed properly. If cities do not decide to maybe only allow them in a shared and electric fashion, for example. So we have this combination of catching up and trying to anticipate, but it is challenging. And coming back to what Jari said, we need data. Because for many of the innovations that have arrived, it's still not clear what the actual impact is of these innovations. Especially when we talk about the new mobility services and the role they could or should play in the overall urban transport system. They all promise that they're going to solve many of the problems, but the question is, will they solve some of the problems, or will they only make them worse, like when we talk about ride-hailing, for example? So data is really instrumental also for cities to have more informed decisions taken and move towards evidence-based decision-making. Anticipation, of course, there you don't have data anyway, but then modeling and scenarios could also be helpful.
But having the information might help prepare the anticipation. Ramon, ITDP works in a lot of developing economies. There is a lot of everyday disruption, if you will, a lot of flexibility as well. How do you feel in those countries where ITDP works, these countries are ready for the types of disruptions that Jari talked about? Are they better positioned or worse positioned because of the way in which society is being organized with the very rapid changes that those countries have had to go through very recently?
Yeah. Well, certainly there's a big gap, of course, between developed and developing countries and not everybody it's in the same at the same level. That many of the changes that we see, especially on technology, often and in a forum like this, it's often ultimately the developed countries. So it would all depends on that level. Because I think in many of the often we talk about leapfrogging technologies, etc., that in sectors like, telecommunications is very easy to adapt in developing countries. Some of the technologies and changes that we have seen in terms of the transport sector may not be the same or as applicable just because of income levels, etc. But I think in terms of in the future, how ready this could be, it often depends on the level of institutionalization of the governments. How easy it can be to facilitate and to shape this. As you can see in the different scenarios, the level of interventions does have an impact on how to shape these new technologies. So and there you have a big spectrum of the in terms of different countries, how prepared they can be. So I think that's very important. For example, for data, to collect data. In some countries, you don't have that facility, and we are seeing that to be able to manage this, you have to require good metrics, and not everywhere you can find that. So that's a big difference in terms of shaping the future. But yeah, everything else I think has been more or less mentioned already in terms of climate change, etc.
I want to follow up with you on one point, because in many developing economies, there's a greater participation of the informal sector in transport, both for passenger and for freight. And that provides a certain flexibility that allows perhaps greater resilience for some of these changes going forward, gap filling, if you will. Are there lessons that other earlier industrialized countries can learn from the way in which changes are handled in many of your countries, the countries where you work?
Well, it's a tough one, and it goes back to what I was saying about the institutions. Sometimes the informal sector, can be more flexible, and but sometimes it's actually the way it operates. It operates like a big block, or sometimes even more like mafia-like. That makes it very difficult to change. So again, it all depends on the level, on political will, and institutions that are sometimes external factors to what we're talking about, no? But are so essential in ensuring that there's a transparency, that there's good competition among the new coming companies, for example. So there is a great opportunity, but it will all depend on how that is managed. So again, their data transparency, institutionalization is very important, I think.
I'm going to turn to the audience very quickly just for a poll. How many of you feel that the transport sector is well prepared to anticipate and to adapt to disruptions? So show of hands. How many of you feel the transport sector is well prepared? Well prepared. Oh, John, a lot of cynics out there. Okay. How many of you feel the transport sector is mediumly prepared? At, I would say it's going to be difficult because they're all different levels, generally. Okay, well, how many of you feel generally that the transport sector is not well prepared to anticipate and adapt? Okay, so there is a real role for keeping to think about what these disruptions are. Black swans. These are the things that maybe we didn't talk about in the Outlook. These are high impact, very hard to predict developments that have had major impacts at different scales in different sectors at different times. Are there any black swans that you worry about? Things that keep you up at night that you don't think are likely, but may, if they were to happen, be quite problematic? Ramon, I'll start with you and then back to Alan.
I think in several parts of the world we have seen how elections can be a black swan in terms of how to direct, especially the public sector, to be a facilitator or agent of change. So, of course, we don't know. We may be in a trajectory to fund, say, high-speed rail in different parts, but we don't know if the next, when you have something that it's such a long term, that it takes years, decades to develop, and you cannot predict who might walk out of an infrastructure meeting when this is supposed to be discussed. I see many people then have not seen the news, but yeah, and then climate change. Of course, in where I'm from, that it's a small place in comparison to many of these countries, but in Puerto Rico, we, after the last hurricane, transportation networks were basically down for telecommunications. So there were many things that were disrupted for weeks. So the impact on the economy is huge, and we will see that more and more, especially in the developing world. So there are many unpredictable factors that could
strongly impactful and unpredictable, and that's worrying.
Exactly.
Alan, did you have?
Depends how you define black swan. I suppose the pure definition is it's something that's completely off the radar. No one is thinking about it, and I don't think there is anything like that. But it's an issue of realization that there are some things which we know about, but we're underestimating the impact that they will have. And getting back to climate change, if one believes the climate science, we will have in the next, 10, 15 years, a climate emergency. The most influential climate change report, it seems to me, in recent years was the 1.5 degree report, based on carbon budgeting, right? So we know exactly how much greenhouse gas we can now emit to stay within 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. I don't think that carbon budgeting message has got across to the transport world, right? Because it's not aiming for some carbon reduction target decades from now on an annual basis. It's the accumulated emissions in the meantime that's the problem. And, we're looking to cut total global emissions by 50% by 2030, right? We're nowhere near that trajectory. So almost certainly we're going to overshoot the target, in which case much of our time, effort, resources will go into absorbing much of the greenhouse gas already in the atmosphere, negative emissions. Now, what are the transport implications of that, particularly for freight transport? the hope would be that we'll absorb much of that existing greenhouse gas naturally by planting lots of trees, but that may not even be enough. So one then has to look at BECCS, bioengineering, carbon capture and storage. We may have to use olivine, or there are a whole series of geoengineering techniques we could deploy to do that. And I think currently we're underestimating the need to do that and what the impact of that will be on global supply chains.
And I think back to your point earlier that for these, if the climate scenarios are to realize themselves as we believe they will, then the adaptation of society to those scenarios will then have an impact on transport that is not yet on the transport radar. Yes. So in terms of freight, logistics, yes. In terms of movements of major materials and resources. Also, did you have any?
My black swan is more about the data security and data protection. I think that we are going into more and more AI and all the communication and cooperation between vehicles and infrastructure and vehicles to X. So there will be a lot of data flowing around, how to protect the individual, the terrorists. There's a lot of things that you could do with that data. So you have to be very, very careful. You have to see the signs and prepare.
We're heading into a much more algorithmic world. Shameless plug, the ITF is releasing a report today on algorithmic governance that will talk about some of these issues. Max or Karen, are there black swans that you feel are important to bring to the debate?
I think black swans, everybody can think about wars and all these things. I would not count them now. But for me, it's not a black swan, but it's lack of decisions. And I think we need to make more decisions. For example, and some countries already decided to be carbon net neutral at a certain point in time. Siemens is driving this since years, and we say by 2030 we will be a carbon neutral company. Daimler yesterday announced they will be a carbon neutral company by 2039, which is 20 years from now. We need to make decisions to change, because like we said, Alan, it's the additional CO2 which is going into the atmosphere, and we need to start now in order to reach the targets. And that's basically for me the biggest black swan.
Karen?
I will not be repeating what has been said, but what worries me is populism and blunt denial of scientifically proven facts, and that includes climate change. And not a black swan because it's very known, but definitely worrying is air pollution as well, especially in cities, and the tremendous impact it has on the health of our people.
A journalist yesterday in the press conference for the release of the Outlook said that if our baseline scenarios or some of the others were to realize themselves, the results would be catastrophic from a number of perspectives, the CO2 perspective in particular. Are we ambitious enough in thinking about how to bridge the gap between the travel we would like to generate because we get value from it, and the impacts we also want to minimize? A question about ambition. We have a high ambition scenario. There are cities that are leaders in developing high ambition policy scenarios. There are countries as well. Also, what in Sweden are you doing to minimize that gap between travel and its impacts?
Sweden has really high ambitious goals. We would like to be the first fossil-free welfare nation. And we have very, very tough goals and targets that we work very, very hard with. We have the climate plan. We have a lot of initiatives on this. But we need to work together. We need to do this, all countries. We need to do this together. We had this joint statement yesterday from the Ministers' Roundtable on how to work together on the climate. It's urgent. We have to act now, and everyone has to do everything that they can possibly do.
It is important that there is a level of co-ambition in scenarios, and that's always something difficult in the political process because you have many different views on, for example, carbon budgeting or carbon growth vectors. How is it that we can manage the divergence of views on the level of ambition in trying to have real impactful changes?
Well, we believe that governments need to be role models, and because there's a discussion, Sweden, we only have 10 million people. What can we do to save the planet or the earth or whatever? But we believe in setting good examples, being, you know, working with best practices, and also try to promote new innovations and new technology and things like that. We would like to be this permanent world exhibition site. So, you know, this is, come to Sweden, we will have the best things for you to work with.
Super, that's fair. Max, you described the ambition of Siemens, which is a high ambition. Siemens is one of many, many companies, some that share your ambition, some that don't. The same question as Sosa, how in an industrial sector where you have many diverging interests and different levels of ambition, how do you push a highly ambitious scenario that allows us to bridge the gap between the types of impacts that we can see going forward and the travel activity that people want to have?
At the end, we are trying to provide solutions to overcome or to reach certain goals which governments or other companies, our customers actually have. For example, an example in Spain, there is the high-speed, or there was actually no high-speed connection between Madrid and Barcelona. And we implemented this ETCS-based, European Train Control-based system together with Renfe, the Spanish operator, and ADIF, the network operator, and the market share they took from the airline industry is now 63%. So there's a significant reduction in planes flying between Barcelona and Madrid now, and it's possible because first the trains are available and they are reliable and they are on time. So if the train is 15 minutes late, and we have a contract to prove and to provide a train which is working and to provide the technology. And if the train is 15 minutes late, the passengers get the full refund of the ticket price. So if you set up such a system based on performance, it is possible to change behavior. And that's what, at the end, technology companies like us are doing. Follow basically guidelines or performance criteria, and then we provide a solution for this.
There's a competition effect too, because of course airlines are companies and have customers and provide value, and in this case you're competing for many of the same customers. Where you're pushing forward some of these low carbon options, do you feel that also pushes your competitors to do the same?
Of course. In our direct competition, they do the same. They offer similar portfolio elements, but also other modes of transport. Obviously, they need to reconsider and need to think how they can achieve the targets which are actually set by governments or cities.
Is it visible, for example, for a consumer making a choice of travel? Do you feel it's sufficiently visible so that your efforts are recognized, that are out there as being, this is a low carbon option versus a higher carbon option at this price point and at this time?
There's more and more what we can see, and digitalization and connectivity, for example, via the smartphones, enables us to provide information. For example, we have intermodal apps in Berlin, for example, where you can see if you want to travel from A to B, what options do you have? You can use public transport, you can use a bike, you can use a taxi, a cab, or you can walk or whatever, and then you get a footprint of the CO2 emissions which you are using, and then you can decide how you want to travel, fast and high CO2 or fast and low CO2, and you can choose. And if this at the end is correctly priced, then there will be a change.
I think the implication is oftentimes it's not correctly priced, which is also part of the governance aspect.
Look, it's not a secret that external effects are, I think, overall in our world not really considered in the prices.
Is that perhaps a high ambition that we are not considering right now, to actually find a way of integrating that external pricing?
From my personal view, I think we are doing a mistake here.
Karen, a lot of cities have high ambitions. A lot of cities have declared their high ambitions. Amongst your membership and those cities that you know of, how was it that those cities were able to sell that level of ambition, which sometimes brings some constraints, a lot of positive benefits as well, to citizens?
Well, unfortunately, or I don't know, fortunately, it often comes down to political courage, you know, and political leadership, and taking that risk of introducing measures which may not meet with a lot of enthusiasm. We need a mix of carrots and sticks to handle the challenges or to deal with the problems we are facing. And what the Outlook report shows very well is how the current ambition and the high ambition scenario lead to very different results, and that we basically have no choice, that we have to be ambitious, even though when you see what needs to be done, it's quite worrying in the sense that this might not actually be happening. The balancing act that our political leaders are currently facing is to reconcile what the citizen wants with what society needs, and this unavoidably will also imply unpopular choices. But in the end, when we see which cities have gone through that phase and have taken measures which met with a lot of resistance initially, ultimately the result has been quite positive. To take an example of a medium-sized city in Belgium, the city of Ghent, they introduced like 2 years ago a new circulation plan, which was quite ambitious in the sense that it was really redirecting car traffic out of the city center. It met with a lot of resistance, but then after 1 year and looking at the results, the positive results in terms of air quality, the increase of cycling, and also the limited effect in the end on increased congestion on the ring road, and then the opinion of the citizens, it all came down to a very positive outcome. So it's not that those decisions automatically lead to punishment in the next elections. In the meantime, this deputy mayor who took those decisions has been re-elected and is deputy mayor for transport again. So this makes me hopeful. But we need to go to ambitious long-term visions that go beyond election cycles, and it's not always easy.
I think there's a very crucial point right there, which is that resistance to change often comes from a view of the status quo, not of the next future that's possible. Yeah. And so maybe one of the tricks, hacks, if you will, to do that is to allow people to experience in a safe space what the future might look like. So temporary exemptions, sandboxing, experimentation.
No, absolutely.
Yes. That seems to be something that has worked well in some cities. I'm going to ask Alan, is this something...
With the congestion charts, for example, also in Sweden. Yeah. Don't ask them first if they want it without trialing it, because then they will all say no.
As far as I know, a lot of those tests are for passenger travel in cities. Alan, do you see any of this kind of experimentation about what the future might be in the logistics sector, in the freight sector?
Yeah. Maybe as an academic, it's easier for me to think of unpopular choices. I mean, I'm not sort of politically constrained like many others. On ambition, there are a lot of good news stories in the Transport Outlook report. Okay, I'm a logistics specialist. I'm just focusing on the freight side. A whole range of things we can do, for example, to decarbonize freight, technological, managerial, behavioral things. But if you factor all that together and look at the effect that has on carbon intensity, okay, you can drive down the average carbon intensity of freight worldwide from maybe 28 grams per ton kilometre down to 7 or 8 grams. Wonderful achievement if we could achieve it. The problem is, as Jari pointed out early on, we're projecting a threefold growth in the amount of freight movement. And that largely cancels out that big improvement in transport intensity. And you also used the word bold, you know, but it'd be quite bold to say that we just cannot possibly accommodate that forecast growth. I know the European Commission's current view is that we're not going to try and curb mobility, right? That's just politically not acceptable. But it seems to me at some stage, you know, to deliver the enormous reductions in CO2 we will require from the transport sector, we have to confront that reality. And just a final point, if one reads the Outlook report, as I've done, it seems to me there's a clash of paradigms currently. Much of the report subscribes to what I would call the standard economic growth model of the future, you know, projecting, in the case of aviation, I think it's the fastest growing freight mode. In the case of the work you've done in Central Asia, looking at how we'll have to expand transport infrastructure to accommodate this huge growth in ton kilometres, that buys into the standard model. Then there's the sort of climate emergency paradigm, which says that we just cannot allow this to happen if we're going to stay within these very, very tight. So I would define ambition is in terms of confronting reality and actually admitting that, lifestyles will change, and we'll have to do dramatic things to stay within these tight climate limits.
I mean, that's a clear tension, and that's certainly coming up in the Swedish debate. Did you want to?
I just wanted to comment that congestion charging in Stockholm and the trial, because I mean, it's not only accepted. I mean, people like it, and they would never want to get it away. What surprises me is that not so many cities has followed. Why don't they just go for a trial and go for a poll and then decide? Because I mean, we have Gothenburg, but there's not very many cities that has congestion charging, and we know that it works very well.
And in other contexts where the problems are even more acute, like New York, it took forever to put in place a congestion charge that we knew could have delivered on the revenues required to fix the public transport system and to limit the congestion in the city. So there is what we know and there is what we do. That is, Ramon, levels of ambition in developing countries. Do we see countries, cities in the regions that you work that are highly ambitious, that you feel are highly ambitious, that are on a trajectory to start curbing congestion, curbing CO2 emissions, local pollutants?
Well, certainly, I think, and you have seen a trend, I think, for some time, especially with I guess when many countries started, or many cities started building bus rapid transit, it was a cost-effective solution for dealing with congestion. But this is an ongoing, battle and struggle. No, especially as some countries start achieving, more income, higher income levels, then and its populations. I mean, we have seen it. In big countries with higher impacts like China or India, when you have more purchasing power, then, it's the individual, mobility that people tend to choose, or to gravitate towards. So again, however, we're seeing patterns of also urbanization that I guess because of the constraints that was mentioned, that you addressed that in the outlook, you see that there are more possibilities for shared mobility, and I think that's I guess that's even though that's the fastest growing mode. It all depends how you shape that, no? So we're seeing that, the challenge is how to make all these more efficient, right, in cities, and especially we'll see how for developing countries that first and last mile and also in developed countries for that matter, can make a difference, and maybe at that level you don't enter so much in the outlook, but it's going to be key, I think, to change some patterns of behavior that could actually change from individual mobility to then, I can take public transport now because that first or last kilometer can be taken by active transport, by scooters, by bicycles or shared cars, etc. No, so
the monowheel. Who knows what it'll be in the future?
Yes.
I think changing patterns and changing choice sets, that'll be part of a question that I'll ask the group next. But first I want to turn to the audience. Max, did you have something you want to add to that?
Just, it's again, I think what we need to do is making decisions, because obviously we need to align and reflect all the stakeholders, but we need to make decisions. If we don't make decisions, we will not go forward. For example, in Siemens, about 10 years ago, we changed the policy for company cars. And before 10 years ago, it was that you get a certain share of money to basically lease a car. And 10 years ago, they changed it. They said you get money depending on your CO2 emissions of your car. So there was a figure. When you are below, you get that money. When you are above, you have to pay more by yourself. At the beginning, everybody was saying, ooh, I can't take that car anymore. But what we see already after 3 years, that the footprint of the fleet was going down. And it's going down every year. And it's just 50 euros per month. So it's not that much, but it is a decision which was made, and you can see the impact. Now we already do the next step. We offer a certain additional salary if you don't take a company car at all, to use, for example, a public transport ticket. So I think the balance, what we need to do is obviously align the shareholders, the stakeholders, and then make decisions and implement.
Alan, you have a comment? I just want to ask, actually, since you're about to make a comment, to turn from your last intervention to the audience, because you pointed out this tension between the climate and other emergency mindset and the sort of incremental, we can muddle along mindset. And I'm going to try to frame this question in a way that doesn't make anyone look bad for answering it. So what I'll ask is, I'll start with your last point. How many of you, raise your hands, feel that we are now in a emergency mindset, that we should be in an emergency mindset when it comes to thinking about future transport trends? You do believe that we are in a crisis emergency mindset if these trends were to realize themselves? Okay, so there are a lot of people. Alan, your comment.
40%?
40% about that,
yeah. Okay, that's great. No, my point actually was in response to inducing a behavioural change in people's travel behaviour, because I've heard the ETH University in Zurich is now carbon capping the conference travel of academics, which is a very radical proposal. And if any academic exceeds that, they have to cover their own conference costs. So I suspect we may see fewer and fewer academics going to international conferences as a consequence of that. But that was just that.
As long as they're not medical professionals, because there's another discussion about who should emit more carbon. Doctors going to the importance of each kilometer traveled is something that's come up in the same context. I'm not saying that transport economists should travel more than anyone else, but it is interesting that there are always voices to say, but this work is more important than that work. And, and it's the same argument that we hear from industry as well, that this kilometer traveled should have more carbon allotted to it because it allows for all these things.
However, I mean, looking at black swans or radical technological developments, we could have virtual conferences. We have the technology to do that now. I've sat in my office in Hamburg and participated in conferences perfectly effectively. We don't need to travel to these events anymore. How long will this ITF forum exist before it becomes virtual?
At least next year, we know that. Let's look forward to the future by looking to the past. And this question of what are the choices that we offer becomes an important one. Transport has undergone several revolutions, from animal power to steam to electricity to fossil fuel, just to talk about the energy. It's gone from expensive and slow to cheap and fast, and yet each incumbent techno-social system, like the one around steam engines, like the one around horses, they have become disrupted and they fall into the wayside. How realistic, this is a loaded question, how realistic is it to think that our age will not experience a similar fate? Will it be cars, cities, and trucks forever? And if you don't believe that, in your view, what will replace it? What will be the social technical system that will replace it? Or what are some of the facets of that system that will replace it, and why? What will be the triggers that will get us on that trajectory? Max. Oh, Karen, so you raise your hand. So.
I don't think there's going to be one thing that replaces what we have, but it's definitely going to change. If I just look at the urban environment, we're moving away from the car in the city, that's clear. It's not that we're going to replace the car with one other thing, like the car has been taking up such a predominant position, but the novelty will be in the mix, I think, and the combination of different modes, the seamlessness of multimodal and intermodal travel, ideally, hopefully, with the help of data, of mobility as a service, and the possibilities generated by that, knowing that it always needs to be framed by other measures that will heavily discourage car use and will make it evident to go for these other options and a mix of those other options.
Max?
I think also the mix will make it happen. We need a strong rail backbone in cities because we need mass transit. But we also need the last mile. I think it was mentioned before. One additional example, the emissions from transport in Germany, there was a study, about more than 50% of the emissions are coming from the motorways, Bundesautobahn. And we are now testing, piloting a system. You can see it outside in front of the building. It's a truck, and this truck has an electric propulsion system. It has a pantograph, and we are currently testing in Germany, and it was done in Sweden already. Is also in operations in Sweden in a 2 kilometers track, and it's done now in Frankfurt in a 5 kilometers track to charge trucks while they are driving on the motorway. And with that, you could limit significantly the CO2 emissions because the trucks normally do less than 50 kilometers outside of the motorways. And if you then have a battery, which you can charge during the driving on the motorway and then do the 50 kilometers back and forth, you basically have no CO2 emissions. So the technology here, again, is there. We need to use it, and we need to make it happen to basically, again, follow certain goals, which, for example, is a reduction of CO2.
Åsa and Alan, you both had a...
I think that it will not change completely. I think there are a couple of things that will change. First of all, ownership. I think that you will not own your transport mode as much as your car or not your bike or whatever.
We'll move from ownership to access ship.
Yeah, mobility ship, whatever it's called. I think the energy mix would change very fast and dramatically, getting more fossil-free. And that will be really quick, I really hope. Also the behavioral patterns that you're not in the same transport mode from A to B. There's the first and last mile, and you will combine. I think the combination of modes getting you from A to B will change. And two things more, you will have flexible size. If you have a lot of luggage, you will have a bigger, whatever it is. And if you're just by yourself, you will have a smaller vehicle, whatever it's called. It could be a scooter, it could be a car, or whatever. And I also think the material that the vehicle or the mode is built of will change. I don't think it will be as heavy as it is right now. More like lightweight or plastic or whatever. So I think there will be a lot of changes, but we will still have different modes that we will use, and some of them will look more or less like they look today.
What I hear in your answer is that there will be these change of behaviors, change of the ways in which we travel. One thing that keeps coming up, but you haven't said directly, but it's in your ministry, is that governments will have to shift from thinking about only concrete infrastructure, no pun intended, to digital infrastructure as well to make all this happen. So the digitalization of infrastructure and is one clear thing that makes a lot of what we're discussing possible. Alan?
Yeah, sort of giving a freight perspective on the question. I mean, I would agree that highway electrification is going to come. I mean, I'm very enthusiastic about that. That's going to be a fairly dramatic change. But other things, if one looks at the last mile, because that's been a very fertile area recently for logistics innovation, there are a lot of curiosities. The question is how many of them will transition into true game changers. You know, so we've seen drones, we've seen surface delivery robots, we've seen crowd shipping where people carry parcels. I think all of these things will develop to some extent, but I don't think they will become game changers, in my opinion. You used the word digitalization. There's also digitization, you know, where we convert consignments into electrons. Now, we've gone quite a long way, but we've still some way to go. I mean, I'm not convinced that 10 years from now we will have newspapers. I think books will be phased out eventually, and that will save us a few ton-kilometers as well. But I think probably the big potential changes won't necessarily be technologically driven. They may be more organizational. And there's increasing interest here, certainly in Europe, in something called the physical internet, which is a longer-term vision of the future of logistics, where essentially we replicate the digital internet in the real world, where we create open systems, we modularize freight to a greater extent, which would allow us to use freight capacity in vehicles and warehouses much more effectively, which would give us an economic as well as a big carbon benefit as well. So maybe, you know, if we look to 2050, I think it's that organizational change which will have the most dramatic effect.
And the physical internet is clearly a big change because it allows us to exploit the digitization of a lot of movements and optimize them much more than we can today.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is how we get from here to there, because it's going to require fairly dramatic changes in business process. Encouraging the large logistics providers still to make the investment in the assets, knowing that they'll be open for wide users. So we'll need new pricing models, and it might take us a couple of decades actually to put those new systems in place.
We've done it before with containers. We've done it before in other areas. So, Ramon?
Well, most things have been said already, but I think two things that I would like to go a little deeper is on what will change. I think the coordination or regional coordination and the role of the state might change a little bit. In the past, I think you saw much more government dictating. And now with so much independence in the sector and private sector, etc., there's a role there for that will sort of like feed each other. So it's not only government dictating, but it's those newcomers, how they will, how data is available, etc. It changes constantly. So the access to that might be, it will change. And I think when it comes to requesting that data, I think it will be key, because now we see much more private operators that may not want to share that. Mm-hmm. And actually that's an area where government might have to intervene, in order to shape this new scenario that it's changing almost by the minute.
One of the things we do see developing are a number of regional and local governments starting to request new data sharing agreements in return for licensing of activities. And not only asking for data, but also preparing themselves to push out law, regulations in machine-readable form. And that's part of making the switch to the internet, the physical internet. The Outlook, as Jari described, tests a lot of scenarios with increased levels of shared mobility of public transport, the original form of shared mobility, that go beyond what we have today. My question for you is, are our regulations ready for that growth? And are our cities physically designed for that growth? Karen, I'll ask you to start.
We're not ready, but we're working on it. As you just mentioned, the lines between public and private are blurring, and we have these new players coming to the market, and those are essentially the new and shared mobility services indeed. So what our cities are doing at the moment is try to regulate those services in such a way that they help to fill the gaps that there are in our current urban transport system, and complement what is already out there. As you mentioned before, public transport will remain the backbone of an urban transport system. This is essential, but there are clearly areas which will never be properly served by public transport either, and that's where shared mobility can, and the new mobility services can play a big role. How should we make our cities ready for that? Not just by regulating those private operators whose interest, and you cannot blame them for that, is still primarily commercial as well. So make them policy responsive, make them play the role they should play in the urban transport system from a policy perspective. So individually regulate those, but also take a number of other measures that will prioritize those modes and give them the space that they need and that they deserve, because they're more sustainable than the car is. So that means that we need access regulations that discourage cars in city centers, that we need to reshape and reallocate space, so give more space to sustainable modes, to active modes, to shared modes, and also use space in a more dynamic way. And this is something, I mean, you've been writing about it, but our cities are increasingly aware of that. Also of the power that they have, because they own urban space, and that's really a valuable instrument and a powerful instrument. So they are in the process of reallocating, and then the next step will be to dynamically do that and also change functions according to maybe the time of the day or what is predominant at a certain moment. And then the whole traffic calming measures pedestrianization, giving more space to active travel is instrumental in that as well. So it's this mix of measures that will make it possible for shared mobility to thrive, I think. But we're not there yet.
In current models of delivering public transport coverage in cities and regions, we recognize that there are times of day in parts of the city and part of the regions where it is uneconomic using traditional economic analysis to provide those services. So cities pay for those services. They subsidize those services. A lot of these new mobility modes also are subsidized currently by venture capital. At some point, that venture capital will remove itself. What will be the evolution that you might imagine in terms of how we pay for uneconomic services that provide equitable access in urban regions? Is it something that cities are already thinking about? Is it something they should be thinking about?
We have organized a meeting recently where we brought our cities together with the new mobility service providers, and this was one of the major things, that especially there, as I mentioned before, where public transport is inefficient, either because of off-peak periods or because it's more remote areas where it's very expensive to deliver public transport services, that especially there, those new mobility services can really fill a gap. But at the same time, we see that they tend to go to the city center first and not really look at the rural areas, for example, whereas there might be a lot of potential. And that's again where the public-private partnerships come in, because it might be more efficient and cheaper for cities to partly subsidize new mobility service providers to fill that service gap than to do it themselves and come up with highly expensive and inefficient systems. And that's another thing that we should be imposing to those new mobility service providers, that if they want to operate in cities, that they should also help to improve social inclusion and so that in return for giving them a license, you also set conditions as a public authority, and you tell them, you should help me to make my system more inclusive. If you look at some of those new mobility services at the moment, like the free-floating e-bikes or the scooters, they're still quite expensive. But there's quite a lot of potential at the same time for them to cover underserved areas and make people living in those areas more mobile, but then you need combination of give and take between the public authority and the private operator.
It's a tense debate. Even right now in California, there's a debate specifically on that, and there's a lot of pushback from many of the new mobility operators on these equity conditions. So it's something that's evolving. Oh, Sa and Ramon, I think it was Ramon, you had something to say about this?
Yeah, regulation is one of our key elements. We're never ready. We're always lagging behind. At the same time, there's a balance when to regulate. You don't want to hinder innovation. And it's hard to regulate things that are not invented yet. We try. I'm not saying that we're succeeding all the time, but we try to go like function-based and not, regulate something that is, technically, specifically some, small detail. We're working with it. It's on our agenda, but we're always lagging behind. When it comes to mobility as a service, this Swedish innovation partnership program that I was running, we had a couple of projects where mobility as a service outside the urban areas, because urban areas, as you said, Karen, they are likely to they're just there. But on the, outside the urban areas, you need to work with other business models. You need to subsidize. You need to find other car sharing, carpooling. But we think that with new mobile phones and apps and things like that, the information it's easier to share information that I need a ride somewhere. But we also need to see the legislation. Are you a taxi or are you not a taxi? What regulatory elements that are in the side of what you're doing. So you have to be careful, but the same, you need to work with pilot projects.
And well, just to follow up on that, that was actually part of my point. I think in many places where you have regulation has a bad name in many places and are shying away from government intervention, and this is actually where it's key that we have healthy regulatory frameworks. So don't get rid of. If you don't, unless you shape it, then you risk, making huge mistakes. Like, just because scooters are now in sidewalks, don't prohibit it. It's just create safe spaces where they can coexist with other modes of transport in a safe manner. No, so we're actually, ITDP is having a report now on regulatory frameworks of transport network companies. That I guess the focus is on 4 major areas on pricing, right, with different aspects, elements, time of day and different aspects that you can play with. Then performance metrics, then the requesting data from operators, and then that coordination that I alluded before, that those are 4 areas where governments should be actively thinking on what is best for their cities or areas of operation.
And this fits very nicely. We call this mobility operating system, that basically a city or a government is able to implement exactly these 4 points. For example, the city of Wiesbaden is currently implementing a CO2-based traffic management system, where they will balance in the future exactly how many cars and what type of cars will I allow at a certain point in time on these and these roads. And with this mobility operating system, the city, the government is able to predict, to plan, to see what's happening. Because if there's no CO2 emissions, because they have made some decisions or the weather is changing, then they can immediately change it and give it back basically to the normal flow. So technology here is already there. It's again a question of let's make it happen.
Alan, you had something to...
Yeah, just extending the definition of shared mobility. I always think transport's very siloed. You've got freight on the one hand and personal mobility on the other. So I've been representing freight, whereas most of the other comments. But what about the potential, particularly at the last mile, to try to integrate freight within personal mobility? Because there's got a lot of spare capacity there, using maybe crowd shipping platforms and so forth. But we haven't said too much about the last mile, because a lot of trends there occurring, which I think are unsustainable. The big online retailers conditioning consumers to think they can get almost instant delivery of a huge variety of products for very little money, and that really is unsustainable longer term, and maybe there's a need for some regulation to control that. But just 2 other points related to regulation. I mentioned earlier how important it is that we increasingly share logistics assets to improve efficiency and cut carbon. And I know a lot of companies were concerned that by doing so, they might be infringing competition regulation. Now, thankfully, the regulators have been quite enlightened about this, and that's unlikely to happen. So I think we should see better use of vehicles by groups of companies. But the other thing where there is a regulatory barrier currently is on the maximum size and weight of trucks. Because at this time, yesterday, I moderated a session on high-capacity transport. I mean, there is an overwhelming body of evidence now to say that this is a very effective decarbonisation measure, allowing trucks, as you have in Sweden and Finland and other countries. So I think that's one set of regulations which could be relaxed for greater benefit.
Also, did you have something you want to...
Just a quick comment. In the countryside in Sweden, the coaches and the buses on the rural areas, they have a lot of packages for the shops and grocery stores and things like that. So we need to use everything that we do.
We are coming up to the end of our time. I'm going to give you an opportunity to be world leader for a day or for a minute. And I want you to think about the trends that we outlined in Jari's presentation. The almost crisis-inducing trends. For some, those are also real potential markets as well. When we think about that, what policies that are not on the table right now in your experience, in your country, in your city, do you feel should be brought onto the table in order to help mitigate some of these And I'll start to give you some time to think about that. And it's not really a policy. So it's a question I actually wanted to ask Åsa, but I think we've run out of time. And it stems from a discussion we had yesterday with a representative of the Finnish government who said that the only way they were able to really get the complete reform of their Transport Act, the complete rewriting of their Transport Act, was because there was a group of committed women from the minister on to all her policy advisors that made it happen by saying we need to think about different perspectives. So if I were dictator for a day, I would like to see a lot more women transport ministers and senior advisors. What would be your policy instrument that we should bring to the table? Yes, Alan?
I'd use a price mechanism. Dictator for a day, a carbon pricing system worldwide covering everything, all products and all services, with a carbon price pitched at, I don't know, $150 a ton of CO2.
Done. Next. Mayor for a day.
It's not necessarily a new policy. It's something that many people are talking about, but still hasn't been done sufficiently. That was also referred to earlier, and that's internalizing external costs and make the polluter pay. And what you said, why has congestion charging not been implemented more than it has already, or given the potential it has? So the pricing issue is key. But then at the same time, finding the right balance or striking the right balance between taking measures that hurt and then still remain socially inclusive, yellow jackets and so on. That's a challenge too.
Ramon.
It's all public transport free.
Mm-hmm.
And,
that's a controversial one.
What?
That's a controversial one.
Well, but then, with different pricing, depending on the level of individuality in your mode. So.
There's nothing to add. If we can realize all the things which just have been said, I think it's on us then to deliver all this. So no further burden on the industry then.
I was inspired by you, and you know that gender equality is really a dear thing in my heart. So opportunities for women in the world to be part of the decision-making process, but also be part of education, workplaces, earn their own money. So opportunities for women and men, of course. But right now, I mean, there's a bigger lack of opportunities for women in the whole world.
Future outlook. We'll have to think about how to model that. So we've had this discussion on stage, and the reason that we had this discussion on stage was to show to you how we want the outlook to be used as a starting point for a conversation about the future of transport. We've talked about some of the perils, the clear perils, the crisis that some of these scenarios would entail. But there's a lot of possibility as well, both in the outlook, but also in the discussion that stems from the outlook. And I hope that's the one takeaway from this discussion, is that by thinking about the future, you can more clearly anticipate some of these developments, more clearly start thinking about how to take those developments and use them as opportunities for delivering on what we all want, which is a better society for our citizens. So I'd like you to give a clear round of applause for our panelists for having participated in this discussion. A round of applause for Jari and his team that are in the audience that helped produce the Outlook. And please continue this conversation afterwards, and we'll be back in 2 years with the next version of the Outlook.